Scott, welcome to this webinar today. And folks who are joining us, this is Scott Holl. Scott was hugely instrumental in helping me with material for the Walter Brueggemann biography, particularly the formation of Walter's early life and his family, his life at Eden. And so Scott is archivist at Eden Seminary. And Scott, thanks for joining me, and feel free to introduce yourself. Anything else you'd like to say about yourself?
Yeah, thank you for having me on, Conrad. I'm glad to be here and to participate in this. It should be very interesting. Yeah, a little bit about me. I was born and raised in a small town in central Kansas called Lincoln in Lincoln County. My background is Methodist and Missouri Synod Lutheran. I became a Missouri Synod Lutheran in college, went to Christ Seminary Seminex, and then finished my degree at Lutheran School of Theology in Chicago in 1986. Worked for the ELCA for a while, did some other things, went back to school, got my library degree at Dominican University in River Forest, Illinois, graduated in 2004 and have been involved at Eden ever since in some capacity. I was hired as a reference librarian in the library and worked there until 2007. And I had the opportunity to become to work in the history and genealogy department at St. Louis County Library, and was assistant manager and then manager there. Worked there from 2007 until this past December. But in those intervening years, I remained part-time archivist at Eden Seminary. And since January 1st, I've been full-time at Eden again as archivist librarian, and I also work in the bookstore there. So,
Scott, what do you most enjoy about your work?
Well, I'm really interested in history. My principal interest, I guess, is German American Protestant history. So my father's side of the family goes deep into the Missouri Synod Lutheran tradition. It's part of the independent Lutheran church in Germany. Some of my relatives are still there, are in the independent church. But I also have a foot in the Evangelical Synod of North America. My great-grandparents belonged to a congregation in Alton, Illinois. My great-grandparents were married at an Evangelical Synod church here in St. Louis. So I have kind of a personal interest in the archives. I have an interest in genealogy and family history. So, they sort of go hand in hand for me, I guess.
Scott, we'll spend most of our time talking about the Evangelical Synod of North America and the ENR tradition. But can you explain the difference between the Missouri Synod and the Evangelical Synod and their origins and their migration to this country?
Oh boy. So both of those traditions come out of the 19th century German Protestant context and are tied together, I guess, in a movement to unite German Protestants in Germany beginning in 1817. That was with the King of Prussia, Wilhelm III. It was an idea that was in the air already. It was an idea that developed through influences of rationalism and Pietism. But it was an effort to sort of overcome these divisions in German Protestantism that had afflicted the Protestant church in Germany since the Reformation. The division between the Lutheran Reformation and the Swiss Reformation, or the Calvinists and the Lutherans in Germany. Wilhelm III basically forced a merger between the Lutherans and Reformed churches in his realm. Prussia at the time was, mostly Lutheran, but the Prussian royal house had become Calvinist in the 17th century. And so it presented this situation in which the head of the church in Prussia, because the the rulers were the head of the churches, was Calvinist, although most of his subjects were Lutheran. He was also married to a Lutheran, and he didn't like the fact that whenever he went to church with her that he could not commune because Lutheran altars were for Lutherans only. And so he basically, by fiat, created a united church. There was a lot of pushback from the Lutherans at that time, and there was, that resistance was sort of punished by the Prussian government. But after Wilhelm III died, his son allowed the Lutherans to go off and form their own church. But so anyway, this was, like I said, it was kind of an idea that was in the air. Wilhelm III kind of got things really moving, but other territories in Germany started to follow suit. So that's kind of how the United Protestant Church in Germany got its start. That idea was brought over to the United States through missionaries from principally the Basel Missionary Society in Basel, Switzerland, also from the Rhenish Missionary Society and others. These were societies that were supported by Lutheran, Reformed, and United churches, and sort of as institutions supported this idea of a united German Protestantism. On the Missouri Synod side, it was a development that was a reaction to this movement, I would say. Like I said, in Prussia, Lutherans who did not want to become part of this united church were persecuted. Eventually, and many of them started emigrating, some to Australia, some to the United States. But I think the biggest impetus for this was in Saxony, in Dresden. There was a pastor, I won't get into the whole history of it, but his name was Martin Stephan, who he and some of other clergy in the area were very much against this idea of the united Protestantism and other rationalist, what they viewed as rationalist ideas that were developing in the Saxon Lutheran church. The official church in Saxony was Lutheran. And the thing that kind of sparked it, and my understanding is that the issuance of a new agenda or book of worship, which included some rationalist changes, they did not like. They also saw, I think, the Prussian government as heading toward trying to create a united church. So anyway, these ideas they were very much against, and their resistance to using the new agenda led to persecution or imprisonment and so on. Eventually, they were allowed to immigrate. So Stephan and other clergy created a immigration society, and they were allowed to immigrate. And so a large group of them came over to the United States up the Mississippi, landed in St. Louis. What's kind of ironic about this is that the old, and these groups are called Old Lutherans because they wanted to adhere to the strict interpretation of 16th century German Lutheranism as expressed in the Book of Concord. But this group landed in St. Louis right after these missionaries from who were bringing over this united German Protestant idea were also already working in the area. So these two groups sort of came together about the same time, and they were diametrically opposed to each other, or I should say that the old Lutheran Saxons anyway were diametrically opposed to the united German Protestants or the missionaries who had this viewpoint. So essentially, the big difference between them is that like I said, the old Lutheran Saxons, wanted to adhere to a stricter interpretation of Lutheranism as found in the Book of Concord. In fact, they came over here in order to create, for religious freedom, to practice religion as they felt they needed to practice it. Their goal was to create a kind of community in Perry County, Missouri, and some did end up migrating down there. But there was a group that stayed here in St. Louis. They founded Trinity Evangelical Lutheran Church, which is still a viable congregation here in St. Louis, and then went on to be kind of leaders in the formation of what's now the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. These missionaries that brought this united German Protestant idea, they came in at different times. They were not organized in the way that the old Lutheran Saxons were. The situation was that beginning in the mid 1830s, there was a huge flood of German immigrants that started coming into this country and going to what was then the frontier. The Louisiana Purchase opened up a huge expanse of territory in 1804. St. Louis became, as we say, the gateway to the West, and a lot of them were coming into New Orleans, coming up the Mississippi and getting off at St. Louis. Many of them stayed here, or they stayed here for a time and then went west into essentially what was kind of the wilderness at that time. But when they arrived, there were no German-speaking churches. In fact, there were hardly any churches out in the countryside at all. Certainly not German-speaking ones. And so there were missionaries who started arriving, at least in this area, from the Basel Missionary Society and the Rhenish Missionary Society. Some of them came here and they were on their way further west to convert the Native Americans, but they got caught here in St. Louis and end up staying. That's kind of the short story. Others came here supported by essentially Congregationalists in New England who were afraid that all these German immigrants would be coming in here and be converted by the Catholics. And so they wrote to missionary societies in Germany, urging them to send missionaries to help develop congregations and to missionize these frontier areas. So when these missionaries arrived here, and the first ones came about 1836 into this area, others went to Friedrich Schmidt went to Michigan in the Ann Arbor area in 1833. So there were developments in other areas of the country too, and that plays into the whole history of the denomination. But for right now, I'll just stick to the St. Louis area. So when these missionaries arrived here, they found things to be totally unorganized. I mean, you had these scattered settlements of German immigrants. They had no churches. Some of them had started gathering themselves in people's homes or in schoolrooms or whatever. So the ones that ended up here, they were on their way someplace else and they got stuck here. They were like, well, we might as well try to work among the Germans here. And others were sent here specifically to do that. And so they started, becoming pastors to these communities, to set up preaching stations, to organize congregations, and so on. Part of the situation was that, there were German Protestant denominations in this country already. I always talk about German immigration in this country as being in two waves. The first wave was in the 17th century, which ended up, with the Pennsylvania Germans and so on. And the later or the second wave, was in the 19th century, beginning principally in the 1830s. So the older, or the first wave of German immigration, brought Lutheran and Reformed denominations to, what's now the United States. And so those organizations were here. But of course, it had been 100 years since these immigrants had arrived and started setting up their churches, and they were largely assimilated. They were losing the English language. They were not prepared to supply ministers who could speak German, and they were sort of surprised by this whole development of this second wave of immigration. So they were unprepared to really come in and minister to these new immigrants. And so these missionaries who were arriving, sort of took the task at hand. One of them who was from the Rhenish Missionary Society, his name was Ludwig Eduard Nolau, arrived in 1836, and he was an organizer. And once he got kind of the lay of the land, and he came to this area with another missionary whose name was Wall, or Wahl in German, Georg Wahl. And they started working, and they pastored congregations. Nolau helped found a congregation that's now St. John's United Church of Christ in Melville, Missouri, outside of St. Louis. But he kind of looked around and said, we got to get organized here because we have a lot of challenges. And so he knew of other missionaries and other pastors who were in the area. And so he sent out a letter inviting all the ones that he knew to come together and discuss kind of their common predicament and how they might support each other. Out of that came an organization that was called the Deutsche Evangelische Kirchenverein des Westens, or the German Evangelical Church Society of the West. So from the get-go, this group adopted a united Protestant doctrinal position. Their confessional statement was essentially the Holy Scriptures as the Word of God and the sole and infallible rule of faith and life. The Augsburg Confession, Luther's Catechism, they don't define if it's large or small, but I assume it's the small catechism, and the Heidelberg Catechism. And where they do not agree, they adhered strictly to the passages of Holy Scriptures bearing on the subject, and then left it up to the liberty of conscience of the congregations to decide for themselves. So, I mean, this is very interesting. I mean, the Augsburg Confession, it's a very kind of, from a Lutheran point of view, it's a very vague statement, because the Augsburg Confession is like, okay, which version of the Augsburg Confession? Because there is the, unaltered Augsburg Confession, the original document, which, Melanchthon, who was the principal author of that, later went on, and in order to try to, Melanchthon wanted to get, he was conciliatory to both the Catholics and the Reformed. He wanted everybody to get together and try to heal these divisions. And in an attempt to do that, he kind of softened some of the parts of the Augsburg Confession to make it more acceptable to the Reformed, and principally in the statement about the real presence in the Eucharist. And so, he produced what are called the Variata editions of the Augsburg Confession. And of course, the confessional Lutherans, or the old Lutherans, would be, totally, against the Variata. In fact, when they founded churches, oftentimes, if you go around this part of the country in these old Lutheran churches, you will see, like, Johannes Kirche UAC, or St. John's Evangelical Lutheran Church UAC, meaning, ungeänderte Augsburgische Konfession, or unaltered Augsburg Confession, to make it clear that they are, the Orthodox Lutherans. So anyway, in this statement, there's the Augsburg Confession. It's not defined which version of it, whereas the Lutherans would definitely say the unaltered version. Luther's Catechism, and then which is of course a Lutheran document. The Augsburg Confession is also, considered a Lutheran document, but, as I said, Melanchthon created a variation of it that could even be signed by Calvin. So, but it's usually thought of as a Lutheran document. Luther's Catechism, of course, and then the Heidelberg Catechism, which is generally considered to be a Reformed document. Melanchthon had a hand in that as well. The creators of the Heidelberg Catechism, I think, were trying to be mediating. They were trying to bring both sides together in this document. Of course, the Lutherans rejected that. The Reformed Church in Germany, this is just an aside, I guess, was, I would say, more of they were trying to be kind of a mediating position between Lutheran and Reformed. I mean, the German Reformed Church, at least in the Rhineland, which is what we're talking about principally, and in southern Germany, central Germany, they did not go on to adopt some of the more stringent Reformed documents, like the Dutch confessions or the English confessions. Their only confessional document was the Heidelberg Catechism. So it was more conciliatory towards, Lutheranism, but the Lutherans were really not going to have any of it. So anyway, and then, but it does set up, this age-old question in German Protestantism, this difference, where they differ. I mean, if you're a confessional Lutheran, there are definitely differences with the Reformed. And what they're saying in this statement is, we're leaving it up to people's conscience, when it comes to these differences, how they want to deal with this. They are to, search the scriptures and decide for themselves. So when you, getting back to your original question, what is the difference between, say, the Missouri Synod Lutherans and these evangelical, what became the Evangelical Synod? This is the principal difference. This confessional statement, the Missouri Synod holding fast to the Book of Concord, the unaltered Augsburg Confession, and these missionaries in the Kirchenverein who are saying, no, we want to include both Lutheran and Reformed in our fellowship, which of course is anathema to confessional Lutherans.
So Scott, when you and I talked earlier, I don't remember if I had this story, but in the 1940s, early 50s, Walter's family lived in Blackburn, Missouri, and there were 3 churches, but the 2 primary churches were the Evangelical Synod Tradition Church that his father pastored at, and the Missouri Synod, Lutheran Synod Church. And his father went to visit the new pastor at the Missouri Synod Church at the pastor's home, and the pastor refused to stand and to acknowledge his presence. And so Walter's father, August, turned around and simply left. This is a long time after this. Some of these differences had already emerged. How long lasting was this tension between these groups? Does it continue?
Well, I would say that this tension definitely continues. I mean, the Missouri Synod still takes this, orthodox confessional stance, and it's not, at least in my observation and experiences, it's not conciliatory to other Christian traditions at all. Maybe that's too strong a statement. I mean, I'm sure that there are individual pastors who are more conciliatory or more open, but as a denomination, definitely not. And it's the Missouri Synod continues to be a very conservative and orthodox body.
Where does Pietism come into this play, into the story? So as I was doing my work, and I think in conversation with you, it seems to come out of these mission houses. But can you say more about that and how you understand this German pietism and the tradition and how it influenced the Evangelical Synod of North America?
Yeah, I mean, the Pietism was definitely an influence, but it was an influence, across German Protestantism, especially in Lutheran traditions. Pietism, I'm not an expert on Pietism, but I know some about the history. But it was, it developed in the 17th century. There was a number of factors to it, but there's what I call first Pietism and second Pietism. First Pietism was a reaction to, devastation of the 30 Years' War, influences from Calvinism, but it was, which were attractive to people, and also a reaction to what had developed as a kind of rigid Lutheran orthodoxy or scholasticism, which was viewed as kind of the religion of the head. It was very intellectual. And people going through this devastation of the 30 Years' War wanted something more personal, more that was warmer, that spoke to them more directly in the heart. And so Pietism adopted some of the ideas, I think, of Calvinism, which was, personal relationship, conversion, personal experience with the divine, a religion of the heart, as opposed to a religion of the head. And it involved things like, Bible study, prayer groups, meeting together, fellowship, and so on. And also to dedicate one's life to living out the Christian message, serving others, serving your community in good works, and so on. Second Pietism developed kind of out of that, I think, as a reaction to rationalism, which was having a huge impact on church life in Germany in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. And it was seen as a way to kind of combat these rationalist ideas and to support true Christian belief. But out of Pietism comes this idea of, that our unity is in Christ. Our unity is not based on these doctrinal statements from different churches, so that if you're a believer and I'm a believer, you might be Reformed, I'm Lutheran, there's nothing to keep us apart. And so we need to work to overcome these divisions. And so that led to this, or supported this united German Protestant idea. And out of Pietism also comes this missionary impulse to go out and carry the word out into the world to those who don't know it. And that led to the formation of these missionary societies. Now, in the United States, we are accustomed to the idea that denominations have mission departments or mission efforts. They're denominationally supported and tied directly to the denomination. This was not the case in Germany. The state churches themselves did not really send out missionaries. There were these independent missionary societies supported by congregations and individuals, which were formed to train missionaries and send them out. And so, the two biggest ones, or the biggest one was, the Basel Missionary Society, which itself has kind of an interesting history. It was largely supported by Lutherans from the Lutheran Church of Württemberg. It was located in Switzerland, though, because there was a fear that if Napoleon invaded, that he would close a seminary. And so it was located outside of the Kingdom of Württemberg to give it protection. But while it was there, it was in Swiss Reformed territory. So It was sort of, pan-German Protestant at the start. And but it was very much supported by the Lutheran Church of Württemberg, and many of its candidates came from Württemberg. So that definitely left an imprint on the what became the Evangelical Synod, because Basel, there were missionaries that came from other mission societies. I mean, the Rhenish Missionary Society for one. There was one in Berlin. There were a few others, but Basel was the big. It had the most impact. Basel sent 150 missionaries to the United States to become pastors. Now, not all of those served the Evangelical Synod, but the bulk of them did. And so it left its imprint. So that's kind of how Pietism figures into the development of the denomination. It also affected, kind of the ethos. Like I said, all German Protestants, I think, were influenced by Pietism in some respect. I mean, even in the Missouri Synod, Pietism played a part. But it's like, in my great-grandparents' stuff, that some of which I inherited, and they were devout Lutherans, they had like Arndt's Gebet book. Well, Arndt was an early kind of predecessor of the whole Pietist movement. But that kind of literature was very much in households, and they were used and treasured. And so, there developed this kind of warm devotional and spiritual life, that was supported by these pietistic ideas. So it was kind of, the Evangelical Synod, I would say it's a very much a kind of state church tradition. I mean, that it comes out of, there were united Protestant state churches in Germany. I mean, the Church of Prussia being the biggest, but there were others, principally in the Rhineland, in Westphalia. But there is this, Pietism definitely left its imprint on its development and on its ethos.
Scott, when we hear the word evangelical today, there's something that comes into our mind that's very different than what was meant by evangelical when we talk about the Evangelical Synod of North America. Can you talk about the difference between what evangelical meant in the tradition?
Sure. Well, I mean, the term has been around as long as the church has been around. I mean, evangelical just means of the gospel. And the reformers, they wanted to center their reforms and their church life and faith on the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so they called themselves evangelisch, which just means of the gospel, to emphasize that goal. So, in Germany, within German Protestantism, evangelisch or evangelical just means not Catholic. Yeah. So it has a different connotation than it does in the American context. I mean, in American context, when you hear the word evangelical, you think conservative or fundamentalist. But in Germany, every German Protestant, of whatever confessional stripe, is evangelisch, is evangelical, because it's Protestant. So that's the main difference.
Scott, everything about the tradition, as I'm listening to you and as coming out of the research that I was doing over the last 6 months, seems to posture the tradition, the Evangelical Synod of North America, towards a kind of ecumenism. Is that true? A kind of openness to other traditions.
When you're talking in the 19th century context, it's hard to talk about ecumenism, because ecumenism is really a 20th century, I think, development, at least in my mind. But the Evangelical Synod certainly had an openness. It was non-dogmatic, and especially in its early development was basically open to working with anybody that shared the same goals, wherever they came from. I mean, when these missionaries from Basel and the Rhenish Missionary Society and others encountered the old Lutheran Saxons, they were like, oh, great, there's someone else here who can help us. And so, they were encouraging them to get together with them because they saw this great need out there. And of course, that did not happen because of the doctrinal differences between the two. There is evidence, I have found evidence of, collegial relationships between some of the missionaries and some of the clergy among these old Lutherans. But CFW Walther, who became the leader of the old Lutherans, was, he was also editor of their Lutheraner newspaper and started publishing just horrible polemical attacks at this group. And so that it just wasn't possible. Especially in his early years, in fact, Carl Schneider, who was the historian for the Evangelical Synod and wrote a book about its earlier history, called the Kirchenverein more of a movement than a denomination, which I think has some validity. As the denomination developed, it took on more and more of a kind of confessional position of this kind of united, meaning Lutheran and Reformed German Protestant, as a German Protestant denomination, united in the sense that it included Lutheran and Reformed, and took that on as kind of a confessional position in a kind of a more strict way. But I mean, they did sometimes work with others. I mean, they had connections, especially to the Congregational Church. Interestingly enough, there was early support from the Congregational Church. Many of the early pastors were supported by the American Missionary Society, financially, and so on. But anyway, the whole point is that there wasn't definitely an openness to working with others. So when the denomination started its transition into English, and through efforts, I think, of a newer generation, younger generation of clergy, such as the Niebuhr brothers and Samuel Press from Eden Seminary and so on, others.
And Walter's father on the front lines of ministry would have been in that fight. That was one of the most challenging, Walter has said, greatest challenges that his father faced. Yeah,
the earliest 20th century was a kind of tumultuous period, I think, for most German Protestant denominations because of World War I. And the Evangelical Synod, it was a struggle to make this transition. I'm sure it was for others too. The Evangelical Synod had a kind of a particularly difficult time because it was identified as the Kaiser's church. Some people, some in the Evangelical Synod always pointed to Prussia and said, this is where we come from. Well, yes and no. I mean, the church, there was no organic connection between the two. It is true that the Evangelical Church of Prussia was the largest and one of the earliest united Protestant churches. But there was one key difference, as I see it, in Prussia. Okay, there were two types of united Protestantism in Germany. There is one which I call the federative type, and this was the type that was in Prussia. In other words, each congregation could decide, is it going to be Lutheran, is it going to be Reformed, or is it going to be united? and they were given that latitude. There was a common church government. The King of Prussia tried to impose a common liturgy for all of them to use, but they could stay doctrinally Lutheran Reformed, or they could, become United Lutheran or United Protestant. The other type of United Protestantism is organic or synthetic, meaning that they try to create a synthesis between the two doctrinal positions in their catechisms and doctrinal statements. So this is what you see here in the confessional statement of the Evangelical Synod, that they try to somehow overcome the difference between the two doctrinal positions into a kind of a third, kind of neutral platform. So this is the kind of United Protestantism that you find principally, I think, in the Rhineland area, where there were more reformed, where the tradition was more reformed. But anyway, but the Evangelical Synod was a synthetic union, not a federative union. So that was one of the key differences. But anyway, getting back to your question, but the Evangelical Synod, because in their literature and so on, they often would reference the Evangelical Church of Prussia, they were identified as the Kaiser's Church, or the, link, they had this link, and so suffered more scrutiny than maybe other German Protestant denominations did during World War I. And there were incidents of pastors being imprisoned or detained. At least one was deported during that period. There was one who was, he was a pastor in Ohio. He was on his way to Elmhurst College to become a professor. And on his way, he was stopped at a train station, arrested, detained for a year, and then finally deported. So you had that kind of thing. And of course, like many, German American communities, these churches faced, vandalism and sometimes violence, or sometimes, that kind of thing. An incident out of my own family history, in the Lutheran church that some of my relatives belonged to in my home county. It was a Missouri Synod church. During World War I, they came to open up the church one Sunday, and there was a note plastered on the door saying, either speak German or else. Speak English or else. And so, there were those kinds of messages that were delivered to these communities. So, but anyway, but the transition to English had already started before World War I. And there was a desire among, the younger generation to speak English. The denomination was not accommodating to this movement, or was slow to accommodate this movement. The denomination had created its own catechism. They had created an agenda or a book of worship. It had created a hymnal. They were publishing a periodical, all in German from the very beginning. Even the catechism, wasn't translated into English until the 1890s, I believe. And then it was produced in a parallel version with English and German side by side. There wasn't an English hymnal until around 1900, and so on. And so, they recognized there was a problem, or leaders in the church recognized there was this problem, because the younger generations were starting to leave the congregations and join English-speaking congregations of other denominations. Up until World War I, the congregations worshipped almost exclusively in German. There were a few that were starting to make the transition by having maybe a second service on Sundays, or maybe an English service once a month or something like that. but World War I definitely sped up this process. At the same time, out of this younger generation came a new generation of leaders like, Reinhold Niebuhr and H. Richard Niebuhr and others from that generation who looked at the church and said, we need to get busy here. We need to get out of this, isolated German speaking communities. And we need to get out of this, really essentially conservative Lutheran kind of practice and belief and start opening up to the American context. We need to assimilate. And so they really started pushing the denomination towards, assimilation. And, this was happening. I mean, the Niebuhrs graduated in 1913 and 1915, I think, so right around this period, and then quickly became influential in the denomination. So
From Eden, they graduated from Eden.
yes, they graduated from Eden, I'm sorry. Yes, Eden was the only seminary for the denomination. So they started kind of pushing things, towards assimilation, and also to, looking, as models to American Protestant denominations, So this kind of helped lead the denomination. It helped turn it away from its isolation into the American context, but it wasn't easy. The general conferences operated still in German into the 20s. Finally, the president's address to the general conference was read in English in 1925 for the first time. The denomination was known as the German Evangelical Synod of North America. German was finally dropped in 1927. So, but this German tradition and the German language tradition persisted in churches in the denomination, especially in the rural areas, into the late 20s, 30s, 40s, even. And you can still find some of these congregations that will do at least an occasional German service sometimes. So,
Scott, can you say a little bit more about the impact of the Niebuhr brothers? Walter tells the story of Reinhold taking American flags to all of the congregations of the Evangelical Synod to promote this assimilation that you're talking about. Can you talk more? I mean, they have a long impact on Eden and on the tradition as they work to move it towards this more American denominational Protestantism. Can you say anything more about their impact long term on the tradition?
Yeah, well, Reinhold Niebuhr was on the board of directors of Eden for many, many years. H. Richard Niebuhr, he went and got his, went to graduate school, came back and was on the faculty of Eden for a number of years, and actually pushed Eden towards developing professional academic standards. Up to that point, graduates at Eden, they matriculated, they went through the program, and they got a diploma at the end. They didn't get a degree. They graduated and went out. I mean, that was kind of the mission house style of education. But H. Richard really said, we need to legitimize ourselves within the American context. And so he worked at Eden to bring it into American academic standards. And so he was principally responsible for Eden adopting what became the BD degree, Bachelor of Divinity. That was later turned into a Master of Divinity degree. But he did other work as well within the denomination. H. Richard he led the effort to find another denomination to merge with. He was like, well, we say we're a united denomination. A united denomination should be uniting. and we need to start looking for some other denomination to unite. So he was appointed as head of the commission for, something like the commission for uniting with another denomination or some sort of, awkward title like that. But anyway, he was at the forefront of the ecumenical relations. I will say that, the Evangelical Synod was also one of the first members of the Federation of Churches, which was founded in 1908, I think, which later became the National Association of Churches of Christ. So he had an influence in that way. I mean,
Can you say something about then the evolution to the ENR tradition and to the UCC?
Yeah.
And what happened to, I think, as I've talked to some folks, there was optimism that the evangelical pietism of the Evangelical Synod would have an impact on this merger with the Congregationalists, but that seed got lost. There was this idea that the word and deed would come together. I think that was Frederick Troy's thought, but that the word disappeared and the social justice piece became more prominent. That's, again, I think Frederick will talk more about that today because he worked hard to kind of try to birth or bring forth more of that seed of pietism from within the tradition.
Well, my knowledge of the denomination kind of it ends sort of 1934, but I can speak to some of this. So like I said, the Evangelical Synod started exploring, the possibility of merging with another denomination, and they were really looking towards American denominations, English denominations, or Anglo-Saxon denominations. So they explored different possibilities. Eventually, they were able to come into an agreement with the Reformed Church in the U.S. So the Reformed Church in the U.S. was a product of the first wave of German immigration in the 18th century. It was the German Reformed Church in the U.S. German was dropped, early in the 19th century. So it had its own German background, but by 1934 was completely assimilated, more or less. So these two groups were able to come together and merge in 1934 to become the Evangelical Reformed Church. Of course, they had some commonality. I mean, they had the German background. The Evangelical Synod, was always willing to embrace the Reformed point of view, which, of course, the Reformed Church brought. The Reformed Church's confessional statement was the Heidelberg Catechism, which the Evangelical Synod also was part of its confessional statement. There had to be a little discussion about the Augsburg Confession in this whole merger and Luther's Catechism, but it was eventually worked out. So that brought that merger. And, the impulse towards the Congregational Church, and let me just stop here a minute. I think that in order to understand the Evangelical Synod, that it's important to understand, how Lutheran it actually was.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I keep talking about it as a united Protestant church. It always said it was a united Protestant church. It never denied it otherwise. But it was largely Lutheran in doctrine and ethos, although non-dogmatically so. And the Lutheran identity was strong, very strong in some parts of the church. Around the St. Louis area, the Lutheran identity was weakened because they didn't want to be identified with the Missouri Synod Lutherans. But you get up places like Chicago, Western New York, and Texas, and the identity was stronger. In fact, unless they have changed it, in Chicago, there is a congregation whose name is the um, Evangelical Lutheran, Eden Evangelical Lutheran United Church of Christ. And there's also a church in Texas that still has Lutheran in its name, even though it's a United Church of Christ congregation. But as a Lutheran, when I look at these congregations, they act like Lutherans. I mean, they look like Lutherans. They worship like Lutherans. They are their church like by Lutherans. They sing like Lutherans. They even believe like Lutherans in many ways, but they're not Lutheran. They're united. So as they assimilated and they were kind of pushed into the American context, this really loosened the Lutheran identity a lot, and the identity became more towards the Reformed point of view as it's found kind of within American Protestantism. At least that's the way I kind of read it. So, but I just want to make that comment that, you will, in Chicago, all of those churches up there had Lutheran in their name. I mean, the big church up there is St. Paul's United Church of Christ, but it was originally St. Paul's Evangelical Lutheran Church. So, and that can be confusing for people who try to, when they encounter this history. But anyway, but getting back to these mergers, so the merger with the Reformed Church happened in 1934, but the Evangelical Synod always had this connection to the Congregational Church. Like I mentioned that, there were early in its history, there were Congregationalists who supported their efforts. They sent some support to the seminary when it was founded in 1850. The American Missionary Society was part, which the Congregational Church supported many of these early congregations, and so there was that connection. But there is this incident where there were some local congregational pastors in St. Louis who approached Samuel Press, who was the president of Eden Seminary back in the 20s, and suggested that maybe they could get together with some of the Eden professors to form a study group. And so these congregational pastors and some of these Eden faculty got together, and they would meet periodically and do this. And this kind of started these connections, which led to discussions, which led to the idea of maybe, there could be a further merger. And so that's kind of what happened. And then in 1957, Congregational Christian churches merged with the Evangelical Reformed Church to form the present-day United Church of Christ.
Scott, is there anything else you would like to share? We have been about an hour, and I love talking to you because you have so much in your backpack that and can speak to. Anything else you think it's important for us to know? I think Frederick will pick up more from in his lifetime, his experience of the church and leadership. And he comes from New York and served in Chicago. So when I interviewed him earlier, it was a very different kind of experience than I heard from Walter Brueggemann growing up in Missouri. So that's interesting to me, the difference between those two.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything else that you'd like to add to what you shared?
Well, just one more thing about the whole Lutheran identity that I'd like to mention, because it's something that's not very well known, I think, is that, in some parts of the Evangelical Synod, the Lutheran identity was so strong that there was a suggestion made from some of these corners that the denomination participate in a Lutheran merger that was happening in 1918 that created the United Lutheran Church. That's a predecessor of the present-day Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. That didn't go very far, but that shows you how strong that sentiment was. This idea that you talk about about pietism and sort of part of that getting lost within the present day United Church of Christ. I think Fred can speak to that more, but I will say that in the Evangelical Synod, word and deed went hand in hand. I mean, that's kind of the that comes out of this pietism, which says that your faith must result in some action, some a lived life. And so you cannot have one without the other. I mean, your action has to be grounded in your faith. And I think that's an important part, and that was part of the ethos of the Evangelical Synod.
Which is the one other question I wanted to ask. How did that get expressed in Missouri in the early, late 19th century? I mean, I know there were a lot of orphanages, or there were orphanages or other kinds of things. Was that the primary expression of this
There was
motivation?
Yeah, there was a great impulse towards these institutional efforts for serving the neighbor. I mean, Louis Nolau, who, if you can point to a founder of the denomination, it would be Louis Nolau. And when he was a pastor in St. Louis, he looked around and said, "Oh, there's these orphans and they're not being taken care of. We need to start an orphanage." And so he started an orphanage. And then it's like, oh, there are sick people who are not being taken care of. We need to start a hospital. So he started a hospital. And, there were ideas adopted from Germany, which which created in the founding of the deaconess orders here, or within the denomination, the earliest being 1889, who, served the poor principally through their hospital work, but also as missionaries and parish workers. When Eden Seminary left its campus in Marthasville, Missouri, which is near once across the river from Washington, Missouri. When they left that campus and relocated to near St. Louis in 1883, there were pastors who looked at that campus and said, "Oh, there's this facility we could do something with, and there are people who have epilepsy and who have mental disabilities that we could maybe serve through this facility." And so they created Emmaus homes for epileptics, and the feeble-minded is what the term was at that time. There were other things, orphanages, rest homes, hospitals. Eventually they adopted aspects of what was the intermission movement in Germany, and created institutions like here in St. Louis. There were faculty and students from Eden Seminary who helped found Caroline Mission, which not only did kind of direct service kinds of things, but provided hired some early social workers. I mean, this was it was founded in 1913, when social work was in its infancy. But, did social work, to try to help change kind of structural things and help people, who could find better ways of living through, various services and so on. So, but all this comes out of this idea that, we are Christians, we need to serve our neighbors.
Yeah, Walter often talked about the tradition as focusing on love God and neighbor.
Right.
Coming down to that basic fundamental understanding,
which is
belief,
I think, a basic of Christianity,
of the gospel.
Right.
Scott, thank you so much for being with us, and I really appreciate it. And I'll make sure that you get a recording of the whole thing, and maybe follow up with some other questions that folks have for us tomorrow. So
great.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it so much.
You're welcome. I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott.